Hi, and welcome to the Living in Savannah channel. I'm James Headley. If the water cooler and fairway talk over the past few days is any indication, there is a reasonable chance that you saw or heard news over the weekend about the National Association of Realtors' proposed settlement in the ongoing Sitzer-Burnett case. In a nutshell, this class action lawsuit argues that home sellers were harmed by the broker commission sharing structure common across America via multiple listing services or MLSs. Essentially, the plaintiffs argued that as they were paying a commission that was split between their listing agent and whichever agent represented the buyer, there were some structural and/or systemic elements of price fixing potentially at work. My aim in today's episode is not to get into the merits of this case one way or the other, nor am I here to advocate for or against the NAR settlement, certain MLS practices, or even certain business practices within the real estate industry. Rather, I want to provide my initial thoughts and perspectives on what this means to you as a prospective buyer or seller of a home here on Skidaway Island, and really just some context to keep in mind so that you understand what's going on here, hopefully a little bit better than the news headlines, but we'll see if that's the case at the end of this. Before doing that, let me thank you, as always, for tuning in and liking, subscribing, and sharing. Certainly appreciate that, and would encourage you to continue to do so. So, how might NAR's settlement and the Sitzer-Burnett case in general impact your future real estate plans? First, let me note that the timeline for the changes under this proposed settlement is mid-July. That's the timeline, with each state and even locality having its own rules, processes, and various MLSs, as well as their own rhythms. Some will likely implement these changes prior to midsummer, while in other cases, you may not see any impact until after Independence Day. So we'll see what happens here in Savannah. Timelines aside, there are two big elements coming soon to the market. First, broker compensation, in other words, commissions, will no longer be published in the MLS. Typically, the listing agent for a home would indicate what percentage the seller is willing to pay to any agent other than their own, who brings the eventual buyer of the property to the closing table. That commission rate has always been negotiable, but I've typically seen ranges from 4 to 6% personally and professionally for what that's worth. Advertised and public rates within the landings have generally centered around 4% the past couple years, though one of the major players has recently raised that in a number of instances to 4.8%. This is the total commission paid by the seller upon closing the sale of their home. And in the majority of cases, the brokerages representing the seller and buyer split that commission percentage evenly. Though, as an aside, one of the major brokers here in the landings has chosen to keep 2.8% and offer 2% to cooperating brokers, again, for what it's worth. Going forward, this percentage to be shared will no longer be a part of the MLS, and the expectation is that individual brokers and agents are free to negotiate it directly with each other. You know, from my initial personal perspective, I can see this kind of getting very cumbersome and potentially raising some challenges or issues. You know, for example, will some buyers brokers be motivated to only show those homes where they're able to negotiate a adequate commission share agreement up front? This runs counter to the NAR Code of Ethics, but how much of a leap is it to think that there might be even some subconscious playing of favorites with respect to properties, pending how different listing agents and brokers ultimately handle this change? You know, will there be a greater concentration of sales taking place within the same brokerage, which I showed in a video earlier this year on the channel? Actually led to about a $30,000 negative result for the average landings buyer. You know, just a couple of the questions that at this early stage have been percolating with me. The second major NAR MLS change coming is that buyer's agents will be required to enter into contractual arrangements, so-called buyer-broker agreements, with their buyer clients. While this has always been an option, and in fact, in many cases encouraged by NAR, the actual practice of doing so has varied considerably from location to location, even agent to agent. I personally have rarely chosen to do so because I felt that if I were serving my clients' best interests, there was no reason to tie us together with a contract when a handshake would certainly suffice. If the client felt like someone else could do a better job selling their home or finding them a new one, I certainly wasn't going to try to prevent them legally from doing so. Now, with this rule and the potential that the first rule change may lead to sellers lowering their commission percentage, since it is no longer serving as an advertised enticement for other agents to bring buyers, the likely result will be buyers agents entering into these agreements and setting minimum compensation levels. For example, in a market where, say, 4 to 5% commission rates are or had been typical, a buyer's agent may enter into an agreement with a client whereby the client agrees that the agent will be compensated at least 2% of the eventual property sale price. The seller may still end up paying this full amount if they have agreed with their listing agent to at least a 4% total commission and have negotiated to share at least 2% of that with any agent bringing a qualified buyer to the closing table. In other cases, though, sellers may opt to take their chances with a lower commission rate, which would effectively shift some of the onus for payment to the buyer. For example, in the scenario of a buyer-broker agreement at 2%, if the seller's commission on offer were 3% to be split 50-50, the buyer would be responsible for paying his or her agent that 0.5% difference. Ultimately, it will be interesting to see how this all plays out in the market for buyers and sellers. Commission rates overall could come down, and perhaps by extension, home prices as well. Or the dollars may just be shifted in a different way, with buyers paying more out of pocket to buy a home. Or who knows? For now, I do know I will keep an eye on things for you. And I'm always happy to answer any questions that you may have. And ultimately, I know that my commitment, experience, and desire to serve my clients in the best way possible isn't going to change, regardless of what comes down the pike. So I certainly would appreciate hearing from you or someone you know if buying or selling is in your future. Until then, thanks again for subscribing, liking, and sharing. And I will look forward to seeing you in the next episode.